Okay, we are continuing with afternoon session. For the moment, we are missing one person from that session, but I hope he will join us, Srđan Milošević from Institute for Recent History. Milevo is trying to reach him. Well, I have no information that he's not coming, so we will see. But I'm really happy to greet here Professor Dejan Jović once more, who is coming from Faculty of Political Sciences, University of Zagreb. I'm really pleased that you accepted our invitation to join us. Then Adnan Prekic, who is coming from Faculty of Philosophy, University of Montenegro. I think this is the first time that we have somebody from the Faculty of Philosophy in Podgorica, so welcome. Besides Srđan, who is missing, we have our colleague here, Jelena Vasiljević, from our own institute, as last but not least person for today's panel. Without further ado, I would give a floor to Professor Jović, and then we will continue.
Okay, thank you. It's actually literally giving a microphone rather than a floor. but that's how we call the mics this day. Anyway, okay, thank you. I'm in a position to talk about a topic that is controversial and I suppose also complex. So I'll be able to say only some points within this, just to point out how complex it is and yet important. And here we have the word post-Yugoslav memory. It's, of course, the process of construction of interpretation of the past that I think makes an important integral part of new national and official identities in pretty much all post-Yugoslav states, and in some of them in a rather specific way, which depends on the outcome of the process of disintegration of Yugoslavia, which, just to remind ourselves, has been rather long, and it lasted from 1991 to 2008 so far. And there is a big question mark whether it is over or not. When it comes to, I think, three specific aspects of transition. And when I say three specific aspects of transition, I have in mind that the transition in post-Yugoslav space was fivefold. It had 5 elements. So it wasn't a single, double, or triple. It was not even a quadruple. It involved 5 elements. One is political transition, the other one is economic transition, the third one is statehood, the fourth one is identity, personal, group, and national, and the fifth one is a transition from war to peace. So it's a complex transition, and I think, I'm not entirely sure whether we can say it's been finished as a process in any of these 5. So I'm not even sure that, for example, there will be no reversal to authoritarianism, so therefore that we can talk about a successful political transition, or that there will be no return to state-controlled economy if we have ever actually, left that concept and replaced it with a market economy. And I think also there are question marks over whether this integration has been finished in terms of the number of states we have, and certainly not in identity and war to peace. And when I say that, I think we need to look at the interaction when defining this topic on memory, the interaction between the transition in terms of statehood, identity, and war to peace. And that's this triangle that I think methodologically would be quite helpful in order to define what type of official memories are being constructed by the new states. And when I say it's done differently in various parts of former Yugoslavia, I think in principle we can divide into 2 categories, satisfied and dissatisfied states with the results of the process of disintegration. Satisfied, or relatively satisfied, I would say, is Croatia. Probably is also Slovenia, but Croatia certainly seems to be satisfied, although there are many in Croatia, or some in Croatia, who think they haven't actually won or achieved everything they wanted, whether in terms of internal structure or Bosnia and Herzegovina. But largely here we are talking of status quo result of that. The outcome of this is status quo, preserving what we have achieved, if we can't get more and so on. But dissatisfied are also those who felt that they were treated unfairly and they haven't actually achieved much, including, for example, membership in the EU and NATO, which for many looks like waiting for a Godot, and for far too long, as we already mentioned earlier. However, I think in all of these post-Yugoslav states, in as much as the political elites, or I call this the identity designers of identity designers, so rather than political elites, those who formulate the narrative, in all of them, in as much as they try to build up a new narrative against the Yugoslav ones, they nevertheless cannot cut links, either in terms of private memory or constitutional design, to former Yugoslavia. And so we see a mixture of continuities and discontinuities. Continuities, for example, in terms of the fact of the territory, and so even Croatia, it was like defending a territory defined by Yugoslavia, and this is the Socialist Republic of Croatia, which is now turning into the Republic of Croatia. Then those who have seceded from Yugoslavia, they claim that the Constitution 1974 gave them right to secede, so they treat this as a stepping stone for the independence. You know, whether they're right or not, that's irrelevant, but they nevertheless do. There is also a lot of continuity in terms of elite composition. In Croatia, for example, alone, you have 80% of Secret Service professionals of Yugoslavia working in Croatia now being part of Croatian secret services, and pretty much the whole police forces and many members of the party and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of continuities with regard to personnel. Also, in 5 out of 6 of former Yugoslav republics, you had former communist elites leading the transition into a statehood. Only in Bosnia this was not the case, and probably this is the reason why it actually was the least successful, the Bosnian case. What you also have, I think, is, and I think is playing a very major role, and that is the fear of new states becoming a new Yugoslavia. So in pretty much all post-Yugoslav states, you have this fear of disappearance, ultimately, or of not being able to reintegrate after Yugoslavia. Just bear in mind that, in fact, disintegration of Yugoslavia was not just the disintegration of a federation. That would be easy. But at the same time, the key Yugoslav republics have also disintegrated. Croatia has disintegrated in 1991, and without external support, it would have not been reintegrated. Bosnia has disintegrated. Without external support, it would not have been reintegrated. Serbia has disintegrated. Since it doesn't have external support, it has not been reintegrated. Yeah? And Kosovo and so on. And I think this process of disintegration has also affected many cities and many families and social structures and people, individuals. And so therefore it was a much deeper process which affected pretty much everybody. It's not that we now, with the disintegration of Yugoslavia, have compact, functioning, consolidated states. And this has produced fear of further disintegration, which is still, I think, with post-Yugoslav states. Yeah. And it's in people's mind, but it's also in the minds of political elite, along ethnic lines, but also fear of a collapse which would be supported by some external forces. I would say that the same questions that were in open throughout the whole Yugoslav state, such as the national question, I think it's still with us, largely. And actually in some areas, such as in Montenegro, this is a relatively new experience. Well, not exactly new, but we see, for example, a major change in ethnic structure of Montenegro, in which now we have 20% of people changing their ethnic affiliation in the period of 20 years, which only shows how flexible ethnic identities are. All the nationalists think they're not, you know, but 20% do change. We see in Bosnia-Herzegovina the largest ethnic group changing the name as a challenge to identity. And the other two groups, Serbs and Croats, fearing of becoming minority. The same fear that, for example, in Croatia, ethnic Serbs had, and Albanians and Macedonians and so forth. And I think we also see some question marks still open about the Albanian issue. And if you go to Kosovo, well, I'm not entirely sure how many people actually want Kosovo. And whether they would want to have, whether they think of Kosovo as a temporary state, especially if it's not, if it is not uniquely, if it is not universally accepted or recognized in the long term, yeah, then it depends on whether it will stay as a state in a long term. But I think that fear of disappearance is creating a specific type of memory, a memory and identity politics that insists on clear borders or tough borders, solid borders. And they are using, I think, if not physical violence to do that, although physical violence was part of the war experience, then certainly discursive violence and the violence in terms of identity, in which, just to bear in mind, I mean, in which, for example, our population census in all of our states, post-Yugoslav states, allow people to have two citizenship, or to be simultaneously nationals, so to have a passport of two or more states, but they would never allow you to be a member of two ethnic groups simultaneously. You cannot be Serb and the Croat at the same time. State will not allow you to do that. It will not allow duality or multiplicity. Although it would give you a passport, they will, except for Montenegro, the others would allow you to do that. And why is that? Because they really need a clear-cut, us and others. Yeah? And this process we can see, for example, in all this, in my view, completely ridiculous invention of new languages and new names for the languages, yeah? And insisting on the image of the other being eternal enemy and not a possible neighbor or a peaceful or a friend, even worse. Yeah? So I suppose the largest enemy of this process is a friend who comes from a different nation. Now I'll move on to one challenge that I see to this process, which is unfinished and unsuccessful, I think, ultimately, or at least not completed, not completely successful, because it cannot be completed. In as much as, for example, Croatian official narrative insists that Serbian is a different language. The only time when they subtitle the Serbian film being shown in Croatian cinema, people went to see the subtitle and laughed at subtitle, not watch the film. So this is one occasion only in 1997, and then they've given up of this idea of Serbs and Croats speaking different languages for practical purposes. But politically, if you say a wrong word, then you identify yourself as the other, and that is a problem in identity terms. However, I think we are facing the growth and emergence and stepping on the political scene of a new generation. And I just want to say a word or two about that process. People who are now my students, and some of them even have graduated already, if they were born in the year when the war stopped, that's 1995, for at least Croatia and Bosnia, now they would be 23. This is 1968 compared to the generation born in 1945 in Europe. Yeah. The people who were born in 45 were in 68, 23. And I see some similarities and many dissimilarities, but I mean, in my view, it is interesting really to notice this new generation, which have been very much under the formative influence of the sort of narratives that insisted on dividing and are largely exclusivistic and nationalistic and hostile to the other. And I suppose for the largest part of that generation, they keep repeating it. For example, if you have students, you would see this, they don't challenge this, they keep repeating. However, it is my impression that what they do is a ritual. They are not thinking about that. And a useful piece of work would be Václav Havel, The Power of Powerless, in which he describes that these shopkeepers in Prague would every time on the 1st of May deliver these big slogans: "Long live 1st of May, live Communist Party, Brotherhood of Czechoslovaks," something, without thinking much about that. Yeah. So they've kept the ritual going, but that didn't mean that the narrative was solid. Yeah. It was a house of cards, or at least it had a potential to be a house of cards. Now, for the rest, I think on the left and right, we see challenges to these narratives. And I see almost equal number of people who are challenging this, from a pro-Yugoslav, sometimes pro-Marxist, pro-socialist, leftist narratives. In Croatia, for example, Subversive Festival, which is a surprising event of a new generation, which challenges the dominant narrative, which is anti-Marxist, anti-leftist, anti-Yugoslav and everything. But also from the left, by challenging the dominant narrative from Ustasha nostalgia and extreme nationalism and theocratic views, in which people should not make decisions because decisions are being taken by God already. And so you see young generation being engaged in this kind of challenges to the mainstream narratives, which are conservative but not extremely, they're not that conservative. Yeah. So we will see how will that go. I think the narrative is a matter largely of a generation. It's very difficult to transfer it into a new generation. I mean, for example, Soviet communism had really a difficulty in transferring this from generation of Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky on to Khrushchev. It worked partially, and Brezhnev. But from Brezhnev to Gorbachev, it didn't work. The same narrative cannot easily be repeated. And I see that there is a potential danger for the dominant narrative in this process. However, I wouldn't be too optimistic, because then again, I really don't know. I mean, it could introduce some instability and create some challenges, including, for example, if it goes into a wrong direction, then it could mean renewal of violence, potentially in the future, or a collapse. But I would also say that for the most that new generation who were born in 1995, this story about the EU and democracy is also something that is becoming ritualistically repeated. It is also something that many of them feel was a matter of the previous generation, not of theirs. And there is also a potential of rejecting of either this pro-EU or at some point pro-democracy or democratic narratives in a new generation. It's been for far too long. Those people who are now 32, 33, for whole their life, they keep hearing about that. And they have nothing else to compare this with. For people of my generation, we have experienced the previous system, and now we have moved to this one, so we can compare, we can say some good things about the new system. But if you are born into the narrative which says this is the only way, the only game in town, there is no alternative, then you are searching for alternatives to democracy and to EU. And that's how I explain, for example, popularity of some liberal tendencies or authoritarian tendencies and so on and so forth. This is a search for an alternative in a system which claims there is no alternative. And then yet again, I'm not entirely sure that they would like to see Putin-like system or leader here, but he seems to be an alternative to something that's been given by previous generation and being imposed to them somehow by the official narrative. That's how I see it. Thanks.
Very much. This was really interesting. We will continue now with Adnan and Montenegrin perspective.
Thank you. In my presentation, I have some kind of the historic perspective of this topic, but I hope so that will be interesting from some kind of the discussion later. In this presentation, I'll briefly look back on the present political ideas and model of political action, communist authorities in the current public discourse in Montenegro, but also in the region. In this context, I try to define fundamental political ideas, Communist Party, which can be actual today. Their ideas survive the period of transition and which can be recognized in the modern public discourse on the country of the region. The focus of Montenegro is conditional because large number of this idea, I'm sure, can be recognized in the other southeast countries. In previous period, I researched political ideas and management model process of the communist authorities in Montenegro. In some of this idea and model in political action, we can be recognized today. I talk about just a couple of ideas from the time, but that is, I hope, so very interesting. That is idea of socialism, idea of brotherhood and unity, cult of personality, and phenomenon of centralism and a unique way of managing the social society. The idea of socialism, one of the basic political ideas on Communist Party is the idea of perfection of socialism and the social state organization. In brief, this idea promotes political message that only socialism can solve accumulated problem in all segments of public life. For communists, socialism is the best way for organizing social relation, and it's applied in concrete experience in all segments of social life. This political idea is strongly founded in the theoretical basic of Marxism and Leninism, and there is a very important segment of the official ideological construction of the communist authorities. The communist, in every form of the progress, he's recognized idea of socialism. Employment, free apartments, free social and health insurance, working rights, free holidays, free education, and a number of other similar activities. Communist is justify establish of social relation. The tradition of this political idea in Montenegro is still very much present. Here is some example. In Constitution, Montenegro has been defined like state of social justice. Most political parties in Montenegro in his name and political program using the name socialist. Also in political programs, most parties promoted the idea of free education, free medical treatment and social security. There are many similar examples, but I hope so we have tried to in discussion talk about that. Second idea can be recognized today is idea of brotherhood and unity. This idea is very important segment of the Communist Party program, which can be described like communist response to the negative experience in the former state in the relation of the national and religious issues. Religious and national exclusivity, conflict, crime and all foreign intolerance characteristic for the Yugoslav people in the previous period in the new circumstance of the socialist government transforming into completely new function. All the differences conditioned by religious and ethnic division in the new circumstance and in the new political framework is a place of limitations transformed to advantage and wealth of new society. This political idea, it will become a cornerstone in the most frequent narrative in the public speeches, textbook and the different forms of creativity. The idea of brotherhood and unity will be symbol example where you call BC breaking up the idea of Yugoslav communities in the early 19th. The idea of brotherhood and unity will again become actual in the process of European integration. In the new circumstance is one of the main message will be need of the regional cooperation and implementation minority rights in all countries in the regions. In the case of Montenegro, idea of religious and national tolerance, common coexistence and civil society like universal value of Europe will be basic of a political turnaround which took place in Montenegro in 1997. The idea of common future, all citizens of Montenegro, regardless in their ethnicity or religion, will be the basic of political agenda in the political parties that have been governing Montenegro in the past 20 years. Of course, from the socialist period, we have some different political ideas and model of behaviors. He is not affirmative. So that is the cult of personality. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia and Montenegro, it developed under the strong influence of the Bolshevik Party. And until the political conflict in the 1948, Bolshevik leader Stalin was a symbol of the communist movement. After the conflict in 1948, according to identical model, begins to build the new cult of personality, cult of Josip Broz Tito. Montenegrin society has a profound tradition of being so-called paterfamilias, and Montenegrin rulers in the 18th and 19th centuries is represented key figures of political, social and economic life. They control all segments of society, and it's interesting they also have an original name in the Montenegrin language. He said gospodar, in translating that is be some kind of the master. The most important political figure for Montenegro communist was Josip Broz Tito, but they also have their local leader, first man of party Blažo Jovanović, and he was the symbol of communist movement, and in this position will be remain until the mid-16th, where they execute political change of generation. Montenegro is not a specific case. All the Republic of former Yugoslavia had similar political symbols. This tradition survived this period. Are you still in the region? We have affection of the leaders. We all testify together to, in this circumstance, political leaders, authority which pronounce cult of personality most acceptable choice from many voters in the region. In this segment, I mentioned phenomenon of centralism, like a unique way of managing social society. That is one of the symbols social authorities represent strong need Communist Party to control all political and social process. The Communist Party accepts the Soviet model of directing management, which implies strong party discipline and clearly defined hierarchical competence. In Yugoslavian experience, the model of governance was called democratic centralization and forces leadership from the one center, unconditional acceptance of all political decisions, acceptance of all party views, and indirect representative. With minor modification and democratization during the 15th and 16th system of directing management preserved until the breakup of Yugoslavia. Change resulting from the breakup of the communist system demanded from democratization and the creation of free and open society demanded change and replacement of this managing model. In the theory, all the countries of the former Yugoslavia have accepted democracy and democratic way of decision making, but this not mean that the political elite renounce earlier models of decision making. Are such model decision preserved and until still can be recognized? Can we identify element of centralization today? Do institutions in our countries function like independently or are controlled by various informal centers? Are we on this phenomenon reminded every year in the report of the European Commission when they noted that many countries in the region represent state captured? In conclusion, I've give some couple of questions for maybe in discussion. Why are the political ideas of socialism acceptable in the brand new of one new ideological context today? How are these ideas shaped our historical experience? Do we really think about our historian and proper way? What impact have the political idea of socialism in the current political and social movement of the country of the region, and how this idea are affected of process of democratization, open society, acceptance of diversity, and all value and which we stand of the progress of European integration? Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan. I think it's really important that we emphasize sometimes the concepts which are persisting from socialist period to today, and we are not really saying that sometimes. Now I will have to excuse Srđan Milošević, who sent us information that he is not able to join us today, but he will gladly join us in the morning session, so he will come in the morning, and I would give floor to Jelena now.
Thank you. Okay, the title here in this agenda does not fully reflect what I want to talk about. It's just a title or approximation of a title of paper I'm about to finish, but I will tackle the topic. I want to actually talk about three things, and I want to use this format of workshop to just bring my ideas on the floor and try to put my ideas as close as possible to what we are discussing today, and that is activist citizenship today in the Western Balkans. Well, first I want to talk something about solidarity, because it's a notion that stands prominently in the title. Solidarity is really a research, not only a research interest of mine, sort of a research passion of mine. It's an overarching research subject that will most probably guide me through years to come, and then I want to explore many different subtopics within the solidarity. Okay, so what I mean by solidarity? Well, I'm actually interested, my general question is solidarity a politically useful concept? Can it be politically operationable? What would it mean to base a political community on solidarity? Would it make sense to talk about normative theory of political community based on solidarity? So that is like my principal question that I'm very much interested in. So within this overarching question, I'm interested in solidarity I'm approaching it from various different angles. On one hand, I'm interested in theoretical concepts and questions, and I will just very briefly touch them, because they're not really, this is not why we are here to debate concepts, but I'm interested in the definitions of solidarity. How do we differentiate between solidarity and other pro-social and empathic behavior? So how is solidarity different from cooperation? How is it different from empathy, altruism? And where is the political potential of solidarity? Because many authors who claim that solidarity is political, unlike other empathic behaviors, like Hannah Arendt, for example, she did this in her book on revolution. They claim that there is something politically inherent in solidarity, so I'm willing to explore this. And I'm also interested in the question of whether solidarity is necessarily a group-bounded concept. So are we talking actually about one and the same thing when we talk about group solidarity, when we talk about national solidarity, when we talk about international humanitarian solidarity? So are we really talking about the same phenomena? So these are some of the questions I'm really interested in, and they're like general questions. Then other things that I'm interested in is also solidarity as a discursive trope. So how politicians, elites, and other actors in public discourse, but citizens themselves as well, how and why are they using solidarity to mobilize people for cause? So what do they mean by it? How solidarity is used as a discursive frame? And this actually has to do with this topic, citizenship and solidarity in the post-Yugoslav state, because I want to talk a bit about how solidarity was used as a discursive trope to legitimize different citizenship agendas from socialist Yugoslavia to today. So just as a discursive trope, as a word, right? And I'm also, on the other hand, finally, like the third thing that I'm also interested in is solidarity as lived experience. So how solidarity as something that we are experiencing and living, how is it transforming actors, and how are actors and activists themselves, because that's the final thing I want to talk about. It's an ongoing research that I'm currently doing. I'm interviewing activists from several movements that are operating in Belgrade, and one of the things that I'm interested in is how the acts of solidarity is transforming them personally, emotionally, etc. So now that was the first thing, was about solidarity conceptually. The second thing is this: solidarity is a discursive framework, and how it was important as a legitimizing tool for citizenship agenda. So citizenship was another topic that I was very much interested in before. And citizenship and solidarity, they were very interesting to me because they form something of a paradoxical duo. You know, you don't have, there is not a single theory or a concept of citizenship that does not presuppose some kind of solidarity as a social glue, right? Whether we talk about national solidarity in Rogers Brubaker term, whether we talk about social solidarity, welfare state, whether we talk about sorry, I'm talking about citizenship. So whether we talk about national citizenship, whether we talk about social citizenship, as in welfare state, whether we talk about multicultural citizenship, there's always solidarity implicit there, although it means different things, right? So I was researching, and that was the title of my paper, how, for instance, in socialism, in socialist Yugoslavia, solidarity as a mantra was best captured in this phrase, brotherhood and unity. That was the solidarity mantra of socialist citizenship agenda, which meant brotherhood of all ethnic groups and unity of the working people. And then I was examining what were the major narratives, what were the counter narratives, and how it was, how this solidarity, how it was put forward on policy levels and how on the level of lived experience. So I will not go into any details, of course, because that's another thing. I just want to briefly just go through socialist citizenship regime to present neoliberal, so to speak, citizenship regime. So anyway, during the socialism, we had this solidarity as a legitimizing discursive tool for socialist citizenship, where we have, for instance, on the level of policies, we have something called Solidarity Fund, Social Solidarity Fund, which functioned in a way that regions of Yugoslavia that were doing better, that the money was in the resources were then transferred and distributed to less developed regions, etc. And there were many practices that that fortified solidarity on the level of lived experience, such as working youth actions or serving the army. That was one of the things. Like usually young men would serve army in a city outside of their own republic, so they could meet people from. So it was designed in a way to promote this. This solidarity. Of course, there were undermining, countering narratives, and they came to, during 90s, to define another citizenship regime, another citizenship agenda that was legitimized by a completely different use of the word solidarity, and that was solidarity with co-ethnics. So solidarity with our co-ethnics became legitimizing principle of the ethnocentric citizenship regime of the 90s in most of the post-Yugoslav states. Also, again, that was the dominant narratives, and there were counter-narratives. Most of the counter-narratives were anti-war narratives, pacifist, feminist narratives, especially in Serbia, displaying something called situational solidarity, defying the principles of ethno-national citizenship agenda, etc. So, just to go to today, and I'm really scanning and I'm going very... I'm necessarily simplifying the argument. If we talk about present-day citizenship regime or citizenship agenda, we can not unproblematically call it neoliberal citizenship regime. Not unproblematically because it doesn't really say much about the complete nature of this citizenship regime and agenda, because ethnocentric elements of regimes are still present. Both on constitutional and legal level and the level of lived experiences, but neoliberal in the sense that the whole idea of the function of the state and state institutions and the way the states regulate citizens and the way they regulate citizens' obligation toward the state, it's put in this neoliberal context with the demise of welfare state, with this idea that citizens should be entrepreneurial, that they should take care of themselves, and you know this whole neoliberal mantra of citizens helping states to pay off their debts, and citizens now being willing to solidarily take, for example, cuts in their salaries in public sector so they could help their state. So in a way, it's a perverse reversal of Canadian, you know, don't ask what you can do, what they can do for you, ask what you can do for the state. So in a way, this perversal take of this stance. But also in this in this new citizenship agenda, solidarity now is not only transformed into this new idea and ideal of citizen and relation between citizen and the state. It's also something that is welcomed by the state, that is put into the place of into the hands of citizens themselves in a function of declining welfare institutions. So it's a do-it-yourself mantra, be solidary. Of course, acts of solidarity are welcome because you should organize yourself and you should help yourself and don't expect states to do anything. So we have solidarity basically coming as a practice to fulfill what used to be the function of state institutions. I will just give you a couple of examples. May floodings from 2014, when everybody was talking about this enormous display of solidarity across post-Yugoslav states, and people were really solidary with each other regardless of whether they were coming from Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, which were three countries affected by the floodings. But they had to be solidary in a way, right? Because there was the response from the states were inadequate or were lacking completely. Or to take the example that is very prominent in Serbia and Bosnia, and that is this phenomenon of sending text messages to raise funds to cure kids who have some terminal disease or who have any kind of disease that needs medical treatments in foreign countries. So states are not paying for that, and people are displaying enormous effects of solidarity in there, like making these text messages. So solidarity is, in a way, it's becoming a resistance tool, it's becoming a new way of survival, but it's also fitting very nicely this new liberal agenda. So it's not necessarily countering it, it's not undermining it, quite the contrary, it goes hand in hand with it. But also, what we are witnessing since 2010, let's say, since the global economic crisis hit Balkan countries as well, is this formation of new movements and new protests that we discussed today and that we will discuss tomorrow as well, is that solidarity is becoming, again, as a discursive tool, as a discursive frame and tool, is becoming something that activists are using to mobilize citizens. So it's becoming this mobilizing factor, and this is now what I want just to briefly mention. This is my ongoing research, the interviews I'm conducting with activists in several movements that are active in Belgrade, so not even in whole Serbia. My sample is very limited, I have to admit, but I was very interested in how they see solidarity as a mobilizing potential, as something that has transformed them personally, but also how, not only that, was not only asking questions about solidarity, I was also asking questions about their visions of political community, political activism, etc. And I'm mostly talking here about what we can call, but again, not unproblematically, non-systemic movements. So we're talking about movements like Do Not Let Belgrade Drown or Down, whether it's questionable whether it's not unsystemic or not because they participated in Belgrade Assembly election. Then like movements that organize around evictions, so there are activists who gather ad hoc when there's an announcement that a certain family will get evicted from the home because of some debt issues or whatever. And also some of the groups that were formed after last year's protests, they were called protests against dictatorship after the presidential elections. So I've only started doing these interviews, so the material is very raw, but only one thing that I want to mention is that related to what Dan Jovic was saying about generations. So that was interesting. I also talked about with my colleague an hour ago about what I found out is sort of a generational gap. There is a difference between, I very roughly classified my interviewees in two groups, those who are born between 78 and 84, they were more or less my age, my peers, and those who were born 19 and after 89, 90, 91, 92. And it was very strange that one of the questions that I asked them is like, how do you see these protests and how do you relate them to 5th of October, for example, in Serbia, or how do you see the connection with the protests during the 90s, because there was this even myth, something that usually people in citizens in Serbia who always resisted Milosevic are very proud of their citizens' resistance, I would say, because of the big waves of protests during the 90s and then 5th of October, so-called revolution of 5th of October. And it's very interesting to see how this younger generation, they have they have a completely different look at what happened at the political history of Serbia and of Yugoslavia. They don't see any connection. They see everything is really new and fresh, and they are very much, they're not really debating these issues about, for instance, what you also, Adnan, was saying about the legacy of socialism. So for them, it is something unquestionable. They just take this revival of interest in the left and the socialist idea. It comes very natural to them. Well, this older generation is struggling to understand it and is very much concerned with issues of liberalism versus left socialism, and what is the connection between left and liberals, and rifts within the left itself. And my preliminary and very provisional conclusion, or something maybe to think about, is that this younger generation, that actually their formative years actually coincided with 2008, 2010, so the years when this revival of socialist idea took place in these countries. So they were in their early 20s when that happened. So it was kind of, they grew up, they became activists, they were drawn into activism with these ideas. Whereas my generation and people who are around my age, their formative age was during the 90s and 5th of October, so where the promise of liberal democracy was, like, liberal democracy was on one hand, Milosevic was on the other. And Milosevic was also something that was associated with socialism, so that was why Serbia is a peculiar case. You know, we all know about this, the socialist countries have this burden of equating socialism with communism, but in Serbia it was even more complicated because socialism was associated with Milosevic and with his party and party of his wife, and it was very, very hard to kind of I don't know, to revitalize this idea. But younger generation, they don't really have a problem because it's not part of their memory, it's not part of their formative experiences. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Well, it seems somehow that you all three connected socialism in a way, and I had a feeling from your presentation, especially in the end, that you gave the answer to the Professor Jovic claim in a way that we are searching for new alternative in this where there is no alternative to integration, liberal democracy, or liberal democracy, in a way that we are searching alternative again in socialism. That is the alternative for those new kids who are coming, because it's not something which they lived as we did in a way. But that was just my impression. Do not take it seriously. And now I would like to invite again for comments. Sasha, please.
Well, I guess predictably, the way that they are exposed. Open the window. the way that Dan summarized these narratives, of course, it spurs my curiosity. I think this was an excellent sketch of the existing narratives in post-Yugoslav space, the dominant one, but also those, let's say, side ones that kind of challenge it or go beyond it. And you also subtly pinpoint that there are contradictions, like, you know, Yugoslavia was terrible, it was a grave for the Croats, but we fulfill 1,000-year long dream by fighting for Yugoslav borders, and we can find these examples everywhere. And then you said you think that younger generations follow it like a ritual, and you use that, I think, in the sense that they do it automatically. Therefore, they are not fully attached to it, they don't understand it, they don't go deeply. But I would say there is some more, and from that there follows implicitly certain possible optimism, because if as Enlightenment style, if they are enlightened enough, they would then challenge this narrative. But there is another possible understanding of a ritual. Ritual is something that you follow automatically, of course, but something that becomes embodied with you, something that becomes deeply and profoundly part of you, for which you are ready to live and die and fight, you know, but without questioning it. And that kind of worries or troubles me. Should we take that into consideration and maybe develop at least two more pessimistic conclusions? One is that this nationalist narrative, or post-nationalist, whatever you want to call it, becomes so deeply embedded in new generations that we somehow failed somewhere. You know, kids from Western Europe don't subscribe to that same narrative. Should we say that narratives, should we compare them not only by saying, like, okay, the state apparatus has the monopoly and they infuse this narrative, but say that this narrative is more attractive than anything else that we can offer them, that anything else that they have within their space, and that would be my challenge, my worry, that maybe these narratives became so deeply embedded that there may be stronger, nicer, you know, they offer better stories that we cannot match. We don't have communism, we don't have Christianity, stories that could seriously match these kind of narratives. Okay, I'm sorry for reverting to the early morning pessimism, you know. Is this, you know, after lunch, you know. And please remove this microphone for good.
Okay. Would you like to respond briefly, maybe?
Yeah. No questions. Before people come with other questions. Yeah, well, somebody mentioned here is you actually at the beginning. Is this socialism now an alternative because it's new? Yeah? So let me just tell you a story that I found funny, but also quite illustrative, as another anecdotal in a way. I had a student who plagiarized Communist Manifesto and submitted a large part of Communist Manifesto as an essay to me. And the question for an essay was to comment on the slogan, proletarians of all countries unite. And the big question was, why should they unite globally, and why is it not enough to do something nationally? And he came back, and I started reading this essay, and it says, like, the specter of communism, you know, people have nothing to lose, but, you know, there are chains and things. And I said, this is clearly a plagiarized essay. So I invited him. And I told him, look, you know, this is completely copy-pasted, you know. And then I actually realized that because it's new to him, he thinks it's new to everybody, right? So because this is completely shockingly new, I mean, he's never heard of Communist Manifesto before attending, I don't know, whatever, my class or something. You know, he wouldn't even think that, you know, we all had, and I told him, look, you know, there are, out of 32 subjects in my curriculum in the university, 8 were called communism or socialism in this or that form. So don't even think to do it again, because they will be discovered by other people who are now teaching methodology or things. They're no longer teaching Marxism, but they know this by heart. Now, this is an interesting point, because what seemed to be, to me, very, very old and boring as a ritual that we read and never understood, you know, we were all like, well, this brotherhood and unity until we started fighting each other in a war. You know? So we were repeating these rituals, yeah? But it didn't actually mean that they were so deeply rooted into our minds and hearts. And Marxism looked very old to me, but to the new generation it looks new. It's quite a paradox in a way, yeah. And I don't think ideologies ever die. They can, you know, they can go to sleep, but they could be easily then, or in certain circumstances, resurrected. But I mean, in answering to your question, well, I mean, whether I'm optimist or pessimist depends on whether I like the system as it is or not, of course. Yeah. I mean, it's a normative statement. Yeah. I suppose those who believe that this is, for example, it's inevitable for patriotism or for stability of the system or status quo that people don't challenge some of these official narratives or symbols, for example. Yeah? or that they don't even notice it or think about this, yeah, then they would be quite happy with this, and they could consider this is this is inevitable. The myths are inevitable for the stability of the state. For you have people who actually believe in that, and the state there's more conservative, I suppose, more based on national identity, and those who are afraid of the disintegration of the state would be quite happy with this, that people embody automatically or automatically accept what's being told. I think they would consider this to be a success. And so there are a lot of people actually, when you tell, for example, I also tested this with my students. When I tell them, do you realize that there is a crown on the flag of Croatia? And most people actually would be surprised. I don't know, but this is with symbols, They keep saying it every day, and they never notice there is a crown. And they don't think why there is a crown. And they don't ask, well, isn't that paradoxical that there is a crown on the Republic of Serbia's also flag, or, many other republics? What does this mean, in fact? So it's deeply embodied, but whether they are monarchists because of that or anything like that, probably not. But they keep repeating these rituals. However, I think we see a situation in which people do not, there are people who think and who challenge, and I think this narrative of there is no alternative is making them angry and unhappy. I don't think we can reconcile. This is a big liberal paradox. You claim liberalism has won in 1989, and there is no alternative to liberalism. Well, that's in my mind, you can't reconcile these two concepts. Freedom always includes an alternative, right? So if there is no alternative, then there is no freedom. There is no victory of liberalism as such, I believe. And you know what? Sometimes it seems to me that it is enough to challenge some narrative strongly. You can do this individually, right? And that the narrative finds itself in a trouble. I might be an idealist, but to me it looks like, sometimes if you say, for example, there is a crown on the flag, well, people will say, oh God, I didn't notice this. They will start thinking. Yeah? And I think this response by those identity designers is one of panic sometimes when you challenge some of these narratives. They want to ban, they want to introduce curricular reform, they are very angry when somebody challenges the obvious. But I think that's the only thing we can do. If we are unhappy with the situation as it is, I suppose that's what we have to do. Whether we are successful or not, then I don't really know. Yeah. So to me, there were many people who will be happy with these rituals being, embedded and not challenged. But still, I think there is a chance. In alternatives. Whether these alternatives would be better or worse than the status quo, that's a different story. I'm not 100% optimistic. I think we may actually go into a very authoritarian future, so the change is not necessarily something positive. Yeah.
Thank you. Jovana and then Claudiana.
Yeah, I wanted to continue this way of thinking of what actually is this dominant narrative that wants to sell itself as the dominant historical narrative, dominant interpretation of history, and also dominant basis of solidarity. And I think many of that is functioning in a similar way as banal nationalism. I think we can talk about banal memory as being certain tropes, dates, symbols that are omnipresent, but we don't, and we recognize them as memory symbols, like Srebrenica flower, for instance. You can find it, you can go to, Raiffeisen Bank in Sarajevo, and maybe the lady will have a flower on its collar, and it's constantly present in buses, stickers. You go to a toilet in a club, you can find it. it's omnipresent, just like public holidays, that very often we don't even know what they actually refer to and how they are called and to which war they refer to. I think they are banal in that sense that that after certain amount of repetition, the original meaning is not important anymore. It's more it's a marker of belonging and reminding citizens that they belong to a certain community and not to another community. So we work on these days and they don't work, and vice versa. This is how, for instance, I think in Mostar the difference is felt. It's not that people really know what they are celebrating certain date, but they know that like on this day you cannot buy in our part of the city and you can buy in the other and stuff like that. So I think that when we criticize these dominant narratives, we also have to understand what is their, how empty they are in their content. And I think majority of citizens are really not engaged with the content. And also majority of citizens, only minorities are interested in these fringe oppositional options. So yeah, I just wanted to add this to the discussion.
I have a question for Dejan. I'm curious to know, how do you link memory with historical facts in your research or in your studies? Because especially in the region where there are different narratives for the same fact, for the same historical fact, and maybe you have to deal with perceptions or perceptions of perception, but not with facts and interpretation of facts. So how do you deal with it if a student does not agree with you with one narrative or with one perception?
Yeah, I think here we come to the approaches to teaching. I mean, if that's the question. I mean, if you ask me about in research, yeah, okay. Well, I'm in favor of liberal approach rather than authoritarian. I suppose is an opposition, right? Which means that the facts should be acknowledged and recognized as facts and not falsified, and therefore dishonesty or anything that would be intellectually unprofessional, I think, should be sanctioned and excluded. So I'm not a complete relativist, especially when it comes to facts and documents, right? I think that is a major problem. I mean, sometimes I'm not an expert in that, and we are here in a place where there are experts, so I wouldn't dare to say that, you know, this relativization of everything has actually brought us to post-truth society in which anything goes, and irrespective of whether there are any proofs for that or not. I mean, but, you know, I do have a problem with this absolute relativization, especially when it comes to facts and data. But also realize that the way we see facts is different, yeah? And that sometimes it is difficult to clearly divide between, you know, our perception and the objectivity or whatever it is. I mean, here we're getting into an area which is not mine, then again, yeah, so I apologize. But I am very much in favor of the facts as needs to be acknowledged, but interpretation should be free, I think. And I, for example, when I mark student essays or anything like that, I mean, there is always this question of do you agree or disagree? And there is no right answer whether somebody agrees or disagrees with something. Yeah? And so, you know, I think person in authority, those who mark essay or those who are in a state power or something, should exclude themselves from the field, from freedom, from the field that belongs to another individual. It is your responsibility and the right to make your decisions for yourselves and to interpret them the way you want. So I have to withdraw as a person of power and authority from your field. But of course, if you falsify, if you do something that is intellectually dishonest and unacceptable, then of course you should be stopped in that. Yeah. But interpretations should be free. And I think really, I mean, my experience with teaching in Zagreb and Belgrade is also quite interesting, because I realized that both in Zagreb and Belgrade, students do not expect that the person in authority encourages them to see things from a completely opposite side and to put themselves into other people's shoes. Not that often. But when you try to do that, they are surprised, but they are very much open to that. They're not resisting. They're not resisting to seeing things from the other point of view. They're just surprised. They don't know how will you mark them. Because if you say, maybe if you say in Zagreb, maybe Serbs were right and Croats were wrong, whether I would then, say, actually, you should come next time with a different answer, which many of my colleagues do because they're not liberal. I mean, they're very authoritarian, and they see themselves as state agents rather than people who withdraw from the field. That's what I think. But solidarity, I have a question for you, in fact, if I may. Okay, I was very much surprised when teaching in Scotland to hear that my students sometimes, there was an essay question which was, do you think equality is feasible, or is it feasible and is it desirable? Right. That's a usual, like, political theory introductory course on equality, socialism, something. And most of them, I would be surprised, who were Thatcherite generation, they said it's neither feasible nor desirable. And to me, who came from socialism, right, I said, okay, maybe you can say it's not feasible, but why? How can you say equality is not desirable? And when I returned to Zagreb, I also asked these kind of questions. They would normally, up until very recently, they would normally say it's desirable, but maybe not feasible. But now, I think it's half or even more who would say the same. It is not desirable and not feasible. So, I don't know if you have had any experience like that, but I mean, on the value of equality and solidarity as such, I mean, do you think it is a kind of universally shared or predominantly shared value, or is it like not really anymore?
Well, I never encountered such responses, but I think it's usually, from what I know, it's when people equate equality with sameness, right? So sameness is not desirable, and equality sometimes. So there's a lot of debates like explaining why equality is not. But in some respects, I mean, they have a point, because in some aspects equality is the sameness. Like, everybody should be treated the same, so there is a sameness in that. And maybe equality is also seen as an enemy of individuality, so there's also this problem. Solidarity also could be seen as an enemy of individuality, because in solidarity there is like this willingness to give something to others, like to help, but it's also to give up on something. Solidarity is oftentimes experienced as a refusal to enjoy a privilege, or refusal to do something. For instance, we can think of a banal example. 3 of your classmates are forbidden to go on excursion because they did something in a school, and then the whole class says, we are in solidarity with them, we won't go to the excursion trip as well. So they also give up on a privilege or something there. So solidarity is some sort of leveling is implicit in solidarity. We act in solidarity by giving something or giving up on something because we believe that everybody should be treated the same. So we as a group, and also some of the authors were trying to differentiate solidarity from other pro-social behaviors, accentuate this dimension of groupness. We, solidarity always implies we. So if I act from charity or pity, it's me who acts towards you. So it's me towards you. But in solidarity, there's also we, a group, right? So I could understand, for people growing up in a system that values and accentuates individuality and individual entitlement and rights, that they could have some sort of resistance towards equality and solidarity as maybe something that brings this groupness thing that could swallow our. The irony, of course, is that this age of hyper individualism, that it comes also with all sorts of actually putting people in flocks and in packs. So there's just this. People pursue this individualistic lifestyles, whereas whether you really have choices or not, and whether you're really individual or not, but that's another issue. Yeah.
Valida wanted to say something. Okay.
Yeah.
I have one question, comment to for Dejan actually. Many times they told me that I am too optimistic because I used to work on the concept of cosmopolitanism, and I was claiming that like Yugoslav cosmopolitan society survived in some terms. For instance, we had this huge cultural production in ex-Yugoslavia, and this cultural production, artistic, intellectual, scientific, is surviving. We are together here, and we have artists collaborating between Banja Luka, Mostar, Belgrade, Podgorica, and so on. And I think that there is a hope in this area to attract, and it is attracting younger people, like music or other forms of artistic productions are attracting new generations and are actually, you know, reaffirming this issue that was not destroyed completely. So that was one of my theses, and many times they told me that I am too optimistic. But do you think that there is a hope for kind of, we don't have to call it like cosmopolitan society, regional society, that will have many things in common, and that will be a kind of open perspective for the younger generations? So this is.
I would just like to ask Filip, do you want also to address Professor Jovic? No, okay, then Professor Yes, and then.
Yeah, well, you see, in some ways I feel that we are now on the same level, or perhaps even more advanced when it comes to some of these exchanges than in some ways we were while Yugoslavia was one country. What I mean is this. I mean, if you look very carefully at the structure of students who studied outside of their own republic in Yugoslavia, during Yugoslavia, with an exception of Bosnia and Montenegro, which was about 20 to 24% of all students from Bosnia and Montenegro studied in some other republic. But for most others, it would be a rare occasion to go to study outside of their own republic. I remember there are data on this. It was like, and then also interethnic marriages were not that common as we sometimes now retrospectively tend to think. And actually, to be quite honest, we in former Yugoslavia didn't really know each other very well, which I think, and Yugoslavia did nothing to have, there was no Federal Ministry of Education, no Federal Ministry of Media and Communication, and no Federal Ministry of Culture. So, and the scholarships to actually do that, if you are from Serbia to go to study to Rijeka and Zagreb, did not exist, over very few. So we now have more Erasmus students in Zagreb than we ever had during Yugoslav times, former Yugoslavs who were not from Croatia. And I remember I was studying 86 to 1990, we had a couple of Kosovans, some Bosnians, one Slovene, nobody from Serbia in Zagreb studying political science. In Belgrade, that would be different. It's a capital city, so some people would go and come and so on. But you know, these exchanges were not sufficient in Yugoslavia. And I still think they are not sufficient, right? But I wouldn't be so much, I don't think we have now, you know, there is no hope somehow. I mean, in this sense, I think it's very important that people get to know each other and and I think sometimes, just I will finish this with anecdotal level as well. You know, students in Zagreb, I had several occasions in which they would come to see me and they would say, "Oh, you know, we went to Belgrade last weekend and it was fantastic," they told me. And I said, "Oh, really? So what was fantastic?" And they said, "Well, nothing was fantastic. It was just like we went there and it was great." So you actually realize that nothing particular happened for them to be fantastic, but the very fact that nothing happened was a very big it was very much against what they expected. And they expected, based on the social narrative, that something bad will happen. Because the Serbs are enemies. They will discover that you are Croat, and therefore, oh God, you know, they're going to come and kill you. Who knows what? Who knows what? Nothing happened, therefore fantastic. Yeah? And the same sometimes I hear, you know, when they come to Adriatic here, oh, well, nothing happened, fantastic, you know, very good, because they expect it, you know, that's embodied in that. And I think the second time they no longer go with that fear, right? Or they do, but I mean, it's much lower. So it's one small step that is sometimes needed to counter some of these prejudice. And I don't think this is, it is not a representative sample, of course, but this is what they say. Sometimes a small challenge can actually endanger a big narrative for some people. But what worries me as well, interestingly, is that some of them say, we have not told our parents that we go, because they would be worried and they wouldn't understand. So that's really interesting and worrying. It shows that, you know, the differences in generations, and it shows that this is still a bit of a taboo. Yeah.
Phil?
Thanks. Just a brief comment on what Jelena was saying, because I know it's 3 minutes to 4, and
we have
and probably everybody would hate me if it would be long, so I'm aware of it. Just from the perspective of political scientists, this solidarity term is in the recent few years starting to play a very, very important role in the political science, because, for example, there are authors like Mark Lila from Columbia University who even wrote a book, and he claims that decline of the left in America is caused by their failure to emphasize solidarity, to emphasize the sense of we, and their focus on identity politics from the minority perspective, because they're saying everybody is emphasizing its own identity and nobody is talking about the sense of we, and this is causing the decline of the popularity of the left. That's why I think that solidarity will, and especially from the perspective of citizenship, will play even more important role in the years to come.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I would just like to, in the end, maybe I could ask a question. When you were talking about rituals and about in a way something which is, and Sasha also mentioned that it becomes part of you in a way. I remember the book of Michael Billig, Banal Nationalism, which I think maybe explains very much the notion of not knowing that your flag has a crown, but still having it, using it as your own emblem in a way. But I wanted actually to ask something which is a little bit different, and it connects to Adnan and Jelena's interventions. Would it be possible somehow to claim that maybe the concept which we adopted, if we adopted in the socialism, during the socialism, at least those 50 years which we had, are still persisting here in a way like these notions which are connected to banal nationalism are, or maybe there is something more substantial behind them. So is it a renewal of socialism, which you said basically, Jelena, that there is, like, after 2008 that we witnessed somehow renewal of socialist ideas, or in our region, or there is something which is I'm asking because there is a deeply problematic notion, as you already mentioned, especially in Serbia, because socialism is somehow neglected and all the heritage which we have is neglected. And I remember that we discussed once about feminist movement in ex-Yugoslavia and how current feminist movement is completely, in a way, not now now it's appearing, but let's say 10 years ago it was completely like never happened in socialist Yugoslavia. So do you think that it's more that we used to have it and now there is no burden anymore of that negative feeling, emotions which we had during the wars because of the wars, or it is general politics of getting back to socialism, which is in the question, and that's for both Adnan and you, basically.
For me, it's not talking about renew socialism, because we must have from the mind a historical perspective this region. We can talk the same with socialism and communism in Yugoslavia and maybe in the Czechoslovakia.
That's why I said in the region, yes.
In Czechoslovakia, if you're talking about communism, that is a totalitarianism.
In Albania, for example,
yes.
It's totally different. Yeah.
But if you talk maybe from the Montenegrin perspective, communism 1945 is a modern idea. You have tribe society, you have no school people, and in this circumstance, communism and this idea is a modern idea. So I think right now we also have some kind of the remember from good past and good stuff from our parents and something like that. But I think that's idea. Who is one of the pillar of the communism and socialism is actual today, but in another way. So I think we try to have some kind of the, I don't know, reconciliation, something like that in this perspective, and in that way we try some kind of the connection with that system and that idea. So for that's maybe acceptable from some kind of the people in the region.
Well, first, I think that, first of all, there's a global context. I mean, from 2010, there's not a renewal of interest in socialist ideas. I mean, Bernie Sanders and his talk about democratic socialism wouldn't be unimaginable in 90s, for example. So there's definitely a global phenomenon, and we're just experiencing from the periphery of the world. And we're also now trying to rehabilitate some of the practices from the socialist Yugoslavia. And if you, for instance, if you think about socialist self-management, the only context in which it was discussed during the late 80s and 90s was in mocking way. Socialism was the subject of mocking, and all the iconography of socialist Yugoslavia, because that was the way you were building a new political momentum in the 90s. And now, of course, with this global trend and this global turn towards, oh God, it became acceptable to talk about it again, and the only natural thing in these countries was to turn to socialist and to Yugoslav experience. And, well, as the literature on Yugo nostalgia shows, it's not only a look to the past, it's always a critique of the present. So it's always in these nostalgic glances towards past, there's actually a glimpse of hope for the future. So I think we're just digesting it, and for new generations, it's not even that they're just discovering it for the first time. Like Daniel would say, for some people, manifesto is a completely new thing, you know, especially because it was considered during the 90s. Nobody would put that in literature. Marx was completely, you know, casted out. So it was, it's not that it was present for those young generations. Socialism was not something that was present in their lives. So they completely, you wanted to.
Just a quick question. I was reflecting now. Is there any existing narrative, even if it's small and not used by nationalists, about crimes against humanity or political victims during socialist Yugoslavia, if any? Because even if it was the best, I doubt, yeah? But used by nationalists? Or? And besides that, some NGOs or something Is there any initiatives?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for this very productive discussion today. We will stop here now and continue tomorrow 9:30 here.